Welcome to All Points of the Pharma Compass, the podcast from the Pharma Navigator that guides you through the most pressing industry issues. In every episode, we'll bring you expert insights and critical analysis to help you navigate and master the entire pharma value chain. Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of All Points of the Pharma Compass. My name is Felicity Thomas and I'm the Associate Director of Editorial and Content for the Pharma Navigator. In this episode, I sit down with Mikesh Udani, CEO and one of the co-founders of Albus Health, a medical device spin-out company from the University of Oxford that's developed a passive and non-contact respiratory monitoring solution. In our discussion, we delve into clinical trial innovations and how these are providing benefits to various industry stakeholders. Thanks very much for joining me today, Mikesh. It's great to have you on. Could you first of all introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background into your current role and your industry experience?
Sure, very happy to. I'm Mikesh, and thank you, Felicity, for this chat. I'm Mikesh. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO at Albus Health. My background is largely in mathematics and computer science and a little bit of investment banking, but thankfully I left that world, got back to technology. We did some research at Oxford, and we started Albus as a spin-out company, along with my co-founder, William, who was a clinician. So Albus helps pharma companies measure data from patients' homes without adding any burden. And we do that using a device that we've built which sits on the bedside table and automatically measures sleep, vital signs, cough, and a range of other metrics without the patients needing to do or wear anything. In clinical trials, which is our core area of focus, it helps collect continuous, objective, clinically accurate data from anyone, anywhere in the world, and for as long as needed, providing high quality data.
So we're seeing a lot of innovations coming through within industry, both technologically speaking and from an approach standpoint. But what sorts of, and you've obviously spoken about your innovation there, what sorts of innovations are apparent within the clinical trial sector that you could highlight for our listeners and viewers?
Yeah, in terms of categories of innovation, I would say digital is a big one. We saw about 10, 15 years ago this transition from patient paper-based workflows and manual workflows to more digital ways of recording information. We went from paper-based symptom diaries to digital symptom diaries, which seemed like breaking new grounds 15 years ago, but now it's mainstream and we're seeing all the advantages of it. So digital is now going into other areas, including remote patient monitoring of data for which patients otherwise had to come to the clinic. There are site-based workflows that are now more digital. And a key area of development are digital endpoints. There is more and more excitement around this. I can't think of a single pharma company that wouldn't have used one in their clinical trials. So over the next 5 to 10 years, this is going to be the next wave of transformation that comes. The other category, well, as we all know, is AI. This is touching so many different aspects of clinical trials, even parts before clinical trials and drug development. And when it comes to clinical trials, everything from data management, having better data quality, doing quality checks, data analysis, to supply chain, and now, from what I understand, even protocol design and protocol writing. So there's so much to be done, so much value to be gained from these two categories of technology.
Great, thank you. Sticking with the technological side of things, I mean, you've mentioned there, a few innovations. Obviously, we've got wearables as well and direct to patient delivery for investigational products. Have these innovations accelerated the adoption of decentralized clinical trials, do you think? And if so, what are the benefits of using a decentralized clinical trial versus the more traditional approach of clinical trials?
Right. Yeah, I certainly think they have accelerated. So when we think of technologies or decentralized clinical trials, let's think of what advantages it brings to the different stakeholders. And the most important stakeholder is the patient. One of the valuable things it's done for patients is that it's removed the burden. Instead of getting them to note down the symptoms every day, we now have technologies that can measure that without them needing to do or wear anything. When earlier we were asking them to come to the clinic every week or every fortnight for 6 months, we can now do home-based assessments, so they don't have to drive an hour and 20 minutes while they're managing the disease and a bunch of other things in their daily life. Secondly, it expands the population that we can reach. About 15 years ago, it would have been difficult to think how an 80-year-old person with dementia could have participated in a clinical study, how a 6-year-old child with a neurological rare disease could have participated in a clinical study. And these are all very important populations. So technologies and decentralized clinical trials have allowed us to go to these patients. It's allowed us to improve our recruitment in clinical trials. So from the patient's perspective, there are many different areas of value that this has unlocked. And then across the whole chain of stakeholders, whether it comes to data managers, sites, right up to the regulators who can now see higher quality data, higher compliance data to take their decisions. So I certainly think that this has been a net positive for the industry.
Do you think that there's any possibility that it could limit the patient pool, though? So, say if those patients don't have access,
Hmm.
high-speed internet, for example, or if they're not overly literate with the new technologies, is there any chance that we
Hmm.
could limit that patient pool? Because it's interesting you said there that we're seeing an expanse, we're
Yeah.
getting more, potential scope to cover more people, but is there any chance that we could also limit it?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. We have to be careful that in our attempt to include a certain part of the population, we're not excluding another part. In our attempts to remove bias in one area, we're not adding bias in a different one. So there is that risk. And I think this is something that is on the technology and technology developers. Technology should be developed to meet the needs of the patient. Technology should work to meet the needs of the patient, not the other way around. So it's a very important consideration if the technology is adding burden, if it's relying on patients. We do know that in clinical trials, patients are sometimes in remote areas where they don't have access to high quality internet. For example, some of our patient populations may not be as technologically literate or not as technologically excited as some others. But I think we've done pretty well here as an industry. We now have technologies that do not rely on patient to have certain digital or physical infrastructure. There are technologies that come with internet. There are technologies that are so easy to use, it does not exclude any population. So all in all, I agree that there is potential risk here in limiting certain patient populations, but as an industry, we are moving towards the right area where technology is working around those risks, and these are well managed today.
Obviously, with new technologies comes the advent of more data,
Yeah.
which is, a very big issue, I suppose, for our industry at the moment. So,
Yeah.
given the fact that the volume of data is growing exponentially,
Mm,
how do companies balance that more is better in terms of data,
mm,
with the growing risk of things like data privacy, which is obviously a big issue, and the potential issue of irrelevant endpoints becoming apparent?
mhm.
Is that where AI is going to prove invaluable, do you think?
Yeah, this is, when we say more is better, is it really better? And there are two aspects to this, which you rightly pointed out, in my opinion. One is balancing signal with noise, and the other one is, of course, data privacy. So when we talk of more is better, from my perspective, measuring more of what matters is better. More in general is not better. Let's take sleep as an example. Say 15, 20 years ago, maybe in a study, we were asking patients to write down every morning how well they slept. In a 6-month study, it's very natural for people to forget to do that or to not remember how they sleep. It's an absurd question to ask someone how well you slept. Most people don't remember. So now we can measure that every day. So that's more data. We can measure that more objectively. So instead of relying on recall, instead of relying on perception, we can measure the physiology directly. So that is better. And we can measure things within sleep that matter. We can measure endpoints that we know are relevant, that are clinically relevant, that are relevant to patients' quality of life. Perhaps what is not better is having another stream of data that says that my sleep score is 80 today and it was 80 tomorrow. And even if a smartwatch measures that every day, that is not adding any value because this is not an endpoint that is clinically relevant. Saying sleep score of 80 doesn't have any clinical meaning. So we have to be careful about when we measure a lot of information to ensure that we measure information that is clinically meaningful, that is meaningful to patients. So more of that is better. The other aspect that you mentioned is privacy, and it's so great that over the years we've become more and more aware of privacy, not just in clinical trials in general, with any technology that we interact with. It is for the very right reasons, and clinical trials or healthcare should be no exception. Privacy should be built in by design rather than being an afterthought. It is very important that we have technologies that do not collect patient identifiable data unless it's absolutely needed. It is important that patients feel comfortable using the technology over long periods of time, that patients have control over their data. Um, just as an example, at Albus, we've done this in a way that patients are now very, very comfortable. We've done studies that are a year long where we've had very high compliance, about 98% data collection rates. And a core reason for that is, we don't collect any personally identifiable information as a general course of data monitoring. And that's been a big advantage. That is something that the patients say has been very valuable to them. And it is when we're dealing with patient data, data privacy is absolutely at the core and cannot be ignored.
So based on your experiences, and this is going to be my last question, which I'm sure you're thankful of, what would be the one trial innovation that you think we'll look back on in 5 years, let's say, as being a pivotal innovation for the industry?
Hmm. I would say one trial of innovation or one area of innovation would be being able to measure sleep. Sleep is just so fundamental to every disease, to our quality of life, to life in general, that measuring that is just a no-brainer. For a patient who is considering taking a drug for depression or considering taking a drug for a cardiovascular disease or for asthma or COPD, um, it would be very important for them to know how that drug is going to impact their sleep. About 10, 15 years ago, we didn't really have reliable ways of measuring that. And now we do. Now we have a way of measuring what is happening in that 8 to 10 hours of the day, which so far has been in the dark. And this measurement goes beyond just sleep. When I say sleep, I'm using this more broadly to say everything that is happening during sleeping periods. So if you're waking up, that is important, but it's also important to measure why you're waking up. Is it because you've had a bad dream, or is it because your symptoms are bad because of the disease progressing? Is that because of your cough, or is that because you're scratching yourself because of you've got nocturnal itch? And these, in my opinion, this will just become mainstream. And we're seeing this in so many different areas in respiratory, now in oncology, cardiovascular, with obesity, with all of these drugs like Ozempic. Measuring sleep is becoming really quite critical. So it's in 5 or 7 years' time, we will get so much value from measuring this parameter in clinical trials that it's going to become mainstream. And we can look back and say, well, this was obvious. We obviously had to do this. We were missing out on about 40% of the day's information. And that is an area of value that we will see in 5 to 7 years' time.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Vikesh. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much, Felicity. Likewise, it was really good to chat.
Thanks again to Mikesh Udani for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode, and I'll look forward to welcoming you back to the next instalment of All Points of the Pharma Compass. You've been listening to All Points of the Pharma Compass from the Pharma Navigator, the essential podcast for drug development and manufacturing professionals. If you enjoyed today's discussion, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. And you can also visit thepharmanavigator.com for even more expert analysis. Join us next time on All Points of the Pharma Compass.